The Super Nintendo, home of some of the best, or rather most super, RPGs, platformers, and adventure games ever made. It took us from 8 bits to 16, and it axed bleeps and bloops so that we could hear sweet, bit-crushed samples of actual instruments. Titles such as Earthbound, Super Mario All-Stars, and even games like The Lion King all gave us something memorable to see, hear, and play. And we'll be covering all these games and more in this video. But what truly made the SNES stand out against the competition back in the day was highly polished and super fun titles, like, I don't know, Kirby Superstar, for example. Kirby Superstar, despite being intended for an SNES release from the get-go, actually began development on the original NES. This unreleased NES prototype was used for internal purposes only, as a way of finalizing all of the ideas that would go into the end product before the team had an actual SNES development kit. This process can be seen with the NES sprites for the yo-yo and cutter abilities, which were released to the public over 20 years later in an issue of Famitsu. The sprites shown look nearly identical to their counterparts in the finished product, with the main exception being the lack of Superstar's signature ability hats. Director Masahiro Sakurai stated that this type of development style is beneficial to him, as the starting step of finalizing all of a game's ideas via an internal prototype makes the rest of development significantly easier, with many of the original ideas having already been partially fleshed out before development of the final product begins to take shape. Speaking of early design stages of a game, The Lion King actually includes a number of levels and characters that don't have any obvious connection to its source material, The Lion King movie. This is because several levels and characters that appear throughout the game come from deleted scenes of The Lion King. During the film's production, the original intention for the transition from young Simba to adult Simba was considerably longer and featured a number of the events that occur within the game. Because the game was being produced alongside the film, these levels were being created during the point when it was decided to have these scenes removed from the film. It was decided to keep these levels and characters in the game, even though they never appear in the film's theatrical release. This means that the game actually includes a more complete series of events than the film, arguably making it a more comprehensive look at the film's planned story. While the SNES had many great platformers, we shouldn't forget its more experimental titles, such as the much-beloved Mario Paint. The game was more of an art tool than a game, but even the game's original release wasn't the most experimental version. The title actually had an updated release distributed exclusively through the Japan-exclusive Satellaview service. This new release introduces support for standard controllers alongside the original's usage of the Super NES mouse, something that, as a kid, would have been a huge benefit considering many people bought the game second-hand without a mouse, myself included, rendering it impossible to play. But this Yushao Naizoban version of the game introduces an additional picture for the player to color in, titled Dreaming of the Moon, created by Mizota Hiroko of Tokyo, the winner of a contest associated with Mario Paint BS Ban. But the game had some secrets that everyone could enjoy. The original release of Mario Paint held a secret message that was rarely seen by painters. When creating any image or animation, if the images are sufficiently large enough and highly detailed, it's possible that the game will be unable to implement compression on them, pushing them beyond the cartridge's 32 kilobytes of SRAM. If this happens, when the player attempts to save their creation, the save robot will display the rare error message of data overflow, including a unique animation that cannot be seen otherwise, which has the robot puff out smoke from its quote-unquote ears with a looping explosion sound effect. Speaking of alterations made for specific markets, the classic RPG Breath of Fire was actually changed for its localization in the West. The most notable change is that the original Japanese release of the game included a stereotypical and racist depiction of a black person. Khan, known as Dank in the Japanese version, had his race altered for overseas markets. Originally, Khan had a tan but desaturated ashy complexion, with a set of full lips and curly hair. This was changed in the West to make him Arabian-esque, with smaller lips and straight hair instead. Why this was changed was pretty much a no-brainer, but this isn't the only 16-bit Breath of Fire title to be censored. Breath of Fire 2 was also censored, though this was done long after the game's first release on the SNES. For the game's digital release on the Wii U Virtual Console, 2 instances of text changes were made. The first being a very simple change of the word damn being changed into darn, while the second change is a bit more involved. One of the game's mini-games was changed, specifically in how it is described. Originally, the translation described the game as being kind of like Othello, with the issue being that Othello is actually a registered trademark and one which had encountered some legal disputes in the years running up to Breath of Fire 2's Virtual Console release. It was likely the easiest option to simply remove this text entirely, which is exactly what happens. The line, "It's kind of like Othello," was simply removed entirely. Another popular JRPG for the Super Nintendo was the last 16-bit Final Fantasy VI. In the game, when the party encounters Cyan, it's possible to find the Book of Secrets, an item located at Mount Zozo in the World of Ruin. Along with guides for understanding and operating machinery, the player finds the book in Cyan's trunk. The English release of the game sheds no light on the nature of its contents, but the original Japanese version gives a small clue as to what's inside the pages. Here, it's referred to as Choto Echi no Hon, which means a little naughty book. In the later Game Boy Advance release of the game, the book was called Bushido in the Bedroom, with the more obvious implication that the book was of a sexual nature. Okay, so look, we know it's a bit of a meme at this point that the original version of Super Mario Bros. 2, which we in the West saw on the NES, was actually a reskin of a Japanese game called Doki Doki Panic. We know it's a meme, but we gotta explain it every time, because it's a very basic piece of information that needs to have context as to what we're talking about, so I'm sorry. What isn't as well known is that the original Super Mario 2 from Japan, which plays more like the original Super Mario Bros. And went on to be known as The Lost Levels in America and Europe, almost saw a standalone release in the West via Nintendo Power magazine. In an interview with writer John Irwin for his 2014 book on the game, former marketing manager at Nintendo of America and founding editor of Nintendo Power, Gill stated, "We weren't doing anything with it, so I worked up with my Nintendo Power agency a campaign called The Lost Levels." According to Tilden, a single NES cartridge containing the original Super Mario Bros. 2 was made, but Nintendo worried the title would confuse the market, and thus they scrapped the idea. The Lost Levels rebranding would eventually make its way to the SNES title Super Mario All-Stars, alongside Super Mario Bros. 1, 3, and the Western reskinned version of 2. As of this video, the current whereabouts of the NES prototype are not known, but it could be a great find someday. Keep your eyes out, perhaps. Earthbound may also have been a sequel to a Japanese exclusive NES title, Mother, but instead of playing it safe, this sequel went far more in depth. During the game's opening, the player must investigate a meteorite that has struck the Earth just a short walk from their house. Along with their friend Porky, the player comes face to face with the falling star, but this scene actually has a unique aspect to it, unlike any other in the game, at least as far as we know. Despite Earthbound being a single-player adventure, by plugging in a second controller during this scene, it's possible to control the light that shines from the meteorite. This wasn't discovered for at least a good 20 years after the game's release. But there is actually more interesting information that comes from the first hour of the game. After encountering the celestial rock, the player is joined by the stout Buzz, though his time in the player's journey doesn't last long, as when returning Porky home to his mum, he is immediately dispatched and taken out. Usually, this scene will have Ness take the Soundstone from Buzz, but there is an opportunity to change this by having a full inventory. If the player has no space on their person to take the Sound Stone from Buzz, he will notice this and not give it to you. Instead, he will transport it to Tracy, meaning that you don't have to hold the Sound Stone in your inventory for the entire game, and it will still record the melodies of the Your Sanctuary locations even in Tracy's possession. Normally, the Sound Stone remains in your inventory for the whole game and cannot be sent to Escargo Express. If you do wish to have the Sound Stone back from Tracy, you must talk to her in person, though there's of course a benefit in leaving it in storage, as it opens an additional inventory slot that would otherwise be occupied permanently. Today's episode is going to be all about games that were released for Nintendo's 16-bit machine of dreams, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. The SNES was the birthplace of many development companies and franchises that continue to thrive in the gaming market to this day. Without the opportunities development teams had with the SNES at the time of its release, it's likely that many of the series that gamers still know and love would have never existed, or at the very least, would have not been developed into what they are today. One hot title for the SNES that pushed one of Nintendo's franchises further than it had ever reached before was The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. The game's subtitle, A Link to the Past, is of course an incredibly clever nod to the game's plot and hero, Link, but this wasn't always going to be the final name for the game. During an interview with Electric Brain magazine back in 1992, Miyamoto provided insights into the game's development, sharing a few names that were juggled around the staff. Some of the titles even sounded like modern takes on Nintendo titles. To avoid the game sharing its name with the original NES Legend of Zelda, one idea was to call the game The New Legend of Zelda, a trend in naming habits that we wouldn't actually see until New Super Mario Bros. On the DS. Another title that was considered was Ganon Strikes Back, which was almost certainly a sly reference to Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back. In this same interview, Miyamoto mentioned that the increased power offered by the Super Nintendo allowed their developers to increase the size of Link's adventure, and as a result, it was possible for them to include any leftover ideas they had from the original Legend of Zelda into the new title that the original NES simply couldn't handle. New concepts were considered, but dropped, as despite the Super Nintendo offering more memory, it still wouldn't be enough to fulfill every idea the team created. One such idea was to have fire spread on its own throughout the fields of grass found across Hyrule, a concept that wouldn't truly be implemented until Breath of the Wild, but which has also appeared in a limited fashion in what many consider to be a spiritual successor to A Link to the Past, Four Swords Adventures. Another idea was to be able to use the shovel to dig into the ground, but rather than just uncover items, Link would have been able to dig out a canal and introduce it to a body of water to seep water into the man-made canal. Miyamoto also makes a brief mention when asked of any game similar to Zelda that they plan to release. He says, "How about Link's Adventure on the Super Famicom?" This was likely in reference to Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, a remake Nintendo was said to have been experimenting with using the Super FX chip. Another franchise that came into its own during the era of the Super Nintendo was Shin Megami Tensei, the original series that would go on to spawn Persona. The third entry in the Megami Tensei series saw players finding themselves in Tokyo Destinyland, a pretty clear parody of Tokyo Disneyland. What the player didn't find, however, was two NPCs which wound up being cut from the game, though they can still be found within its data. These demons depict a mouse and duck wielding swords and a chainsaw respectively. These monsters were likely cut for looking almost exactly like Disney's Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck. Even though the intent was to parody the characters, which could be argued as fair use in a court of law, they may not have wanted to risk any legal action from Disney. That said, the two demonic parodies do appear in the PC Engine release of the game, though they've been reworked to distance themselves in appearance from their Super Famicom counterparts. Their names in the game are still a bit on the nose, being referred to as Zombie Mouse and Demon Duck. Speaking of game series with strong cult followings, Star Fox 2 is a pretty fascinating example of a cancelled game that had a continued presence throughout the years, with a post-console digital exclusive release from Nintendo. But some of the game's most interesting elements can't be seen without ripping off the hood and taking a peek at the innards. Argonaut Software did the bulk of the work on Star Fox 2, and were led at the time by Dylan Cuthbert. Cuthbert created many of the tools which were used to make the game, and he also took on the role of lead programmer. This would be pretty evident in the game's data, as it's possible to find a hidden credit within the game's files in the form of a 64-character wide ASCII art that spells out Cuthbert's full name. Another point of interest is a different line of unused text which reads Starglider 01 November 1991. This text is most likely a leftover from the prototype build of the original Star Fox. The early development version of Star Fox, which went under the name Starglider, leaked online in 2020, revealing an interesting stage of the game's creation. The prototype had no title screen or menus. In fact, it doesn't even feature any of the regular Star Fox crew in any form. All that is really available is a version of the game's map, which is pretty different from what would be featured in the final build, and an almost completely different version of the game's soundtrack, with more of an emphasis on a rock style of music. Of course, stages were also very dissimilar from what would be seen in the final game, and several smaller elements would be changed, like the player's R-Wing, which originally had extremely thin wings and a rear composed of just 3 polygons. But Star Fox wasn't the only Nintendo franchise that would experiment with 3D visuals. Super Mario RPG Legend of the 7 Stars is another top-tier game for the SNES, which was noteworthy for its graphics back in the day. The game has many secrets, and we've covered a few of them before, such as the title's regional differences. But since our video on the game a few years ago, many more Japan-only Easter eggs have come to light thanks to Clyde Mandelin's work over at Legends of Localization. The original Super Famicom release has quite a few sly nods to anime hidden within the thoughts of Mario's foe. Mallow, one of the characters that joins the player's party, has the ability to read the minds of enemies in battle, but their thoughts are different between regions. In the English game, the Terrapin enemy is pondering, "Yo, what's going on?" A basic translation that actually removes a reference to Dragon Ball. In the Japanese game, the enemy thinks, "Yo, I'm Nokohei. Are you watching, Grandpa?" With Nokohei being its Japanese name. This not only references the line, "Yo, I'm Goku," which plays at the end of every Dragon Ball episode in the Japanese dub, but the second half of the line alludes to Goku's grandpa, Gohan. The Crook enemy also references a very popular anime, but not in the English game. If the player scans their mind in the Western release, it'll say, "You can't run away, ha!" But the Japanese version says, "Mustn't run away, mustn't run away." This is a reference to Neon Genesis Evangelion's very first episode, where Shinji mutters to himself, "I mustn't run away," over and over again. Even Mario RPG's Hammer Brothers reference anime in their noggins. In the English game, they simply think, "I love my hammer." But in the Japanese game, their minds read, "My hammer tonight is a little bit different, turtle turtle." This is a nod to Lapan III's Goemon, who will say, "My Zantetsuken tonight is a little bit different." Zantetsuken, by the way, is a kind of sword that's either rumoured or believed to be able to cut through steel or iron. Ah, the Super Nintendo. An amazing step forward for the world of gaming. Coming after Nintendo's first home console, many of the core fundamentals of what a home console was had already been established, but the SNES was able to offer more power and more opportunities to progress those fundamentals even further. Everything about the console saw improvements over the NES, with more buttons, more graphical variety, better music, and with that, arguably, better games. Platformers like Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island and Donkey Kong Country 2, fighting games like Primal Rage, and awesome RPGs like Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, and Super Mario RPG. But first, we're going to take a look at one of our favourite titles on the system, Mega Man X. Many new designs and characters were introduced to the Mega Man franchise with this next generation of games. Mega Man X took the original formula and gave it just a little bit of modern spice. Some of that spice included new characters like Vile, a Reploid war machine, who many have compared to other pop culture icons such as Star Wars bounty hunter Boba Fett. Vile's original Japanese name was Vava, which some argued was changed to Vile in international releases out of the fear that Lucasfilm would sue Capcom as a result of Vava being just a touch too close to Boba, with V's and B's sometimes being used interchangeably in Japanese. However, in an interview conducted in 2012, Capcom character designer Tom Pon stated that Vile's design was inspired by another character in pop culture, but not Boba Fett. The true inspiration was Bubba Zanetti from the 1979 George Miller film Mad Max, with Vava being similar to the transliterated name of the character Baba Zanetti. It would only be later in the Mega Man X series, with the release of Mega Man X8, that Vile's colours were changed from purple to green as a sort of nod to the similarities the character had with Boba Fett. Next up, we're talking about another favourite of ours. Yoshi's Island was a sequel to Super Mario World, with Mario taking on a younger appearance as a baby. But it doesn't seem as though the game was always intended to be a Mario title. With the infamous Giga Leak event, in which many of Nintendo's early assets were leaked online for all to dissect, assets pertaining to Yoshi's Island stood out to many, particularly when it came to its graphics. This includes an early sprite sheet for Yoshi, which didn't even have Mario present. Instead, Mario's role is taken by what appears to be a young wizard. This could lead you to believe that the original plot of the game wouldn't have involved Yoshi saving Mario, but rather Yoshi saving a wizard. Not only does this character have graphics for the main gameplay sections of the game, but even the game's opening, suggesting that this may not have been just a simple generic placeholder character, but rather one that would have had some considerations made. Other unused concepts can be found deep into these archives too, which back up claims made by Miyamoto in a 1995 interview. A sprite sheet for Mario can be found which shows him in his adult state, which, according to Miyamoto, was the original plan for when Yoshi obtained an invincibility star. Instead of baby Mario being given extra power, Mario would have quickly aged to his adult state. The concept was dropped because it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. The interviewer mentioned that from a sales point of view, a game where you control Mario rather than Yoshi would probably sell more, to which Miyamoto responded with, "Yes, and that's why we added the ability to transform into Super Baby Mario when you pick up a star. In fact, our first idea was that the baby would transform into fully grown, mustachioed Mario when you got the star. But another staff member pointed out how that would be weird with the story, so we kept him as Super Baby Mario. Personally, I still think the idea of adult Mario running around is better." Speaking of mustachioed Mario, Baby Mario's appearance was also altered during development, with graphics existing for the character in a bonnet as a baby, still donning his iconic facial hair. Frankly, it's just a bit unsettling. This next game wouldn't be seen in stores 2 years after it released, all thanks to complaints in the United States. In 1996, a mother from Gilbert, Arizona, started a grassroots campaign to have the SNES port of Primal Rage pulled from store shelves, despite the game having been on the market for 2 years at that point. The campaign had a limited amount of success, with the initial controversy coming about as a result of her 11-year-old son executing Chaos's fatality, the Golden Shower, a move in which the beast finishes off his opponent by urinating on them. A shocking and grotesque finisher for those without a sense of humor. Time Warner Interactive, who published the title, dismissed the claim because the mother decided to go straight to the media as a first port of call, rather than approaching either themselves or the game's developer, Atari. The company managed to prove their point when they decided to resubmit the game for a rating from the ESRB to get a second opinion, where the board decided to give the game a T14 rating, the same rating that the board had concluded the game should be released with already. Having not changed the rating of their game, Time Warner made a point of chastising the mother for criticizing the game for its content when she willfully ignored the age rating given for the game and let her 11-year-old play a game that was given a rating above his age. Next up, we're talking about the SNES exclusive Uni Racers, or Uni Rally in PAL regions. The game's developers, DMA Design, once had a strong relationship with Nintendo and planned to reference this connection in an earlier version of the game. As seen in pre-release footage from a Nintendo Power Previews commercial, the game's tours were once planned to be named after Nintendo franchises. including The Legend of Zelda, Super Mario, Kirby, Metroid, Donkey Kong, Yoshi, Wario, Star Fox, and one tour was named after the Ultra 64, which was the original name for the Nintendo 64. But this is far from the game's only interesting tidbit. There are 16 different races in the game, each functioning as a save file that you can name. However, some names just won't work. If the player enters a common swear word or a word that's generally taboo, the game will say, "not cool enough," and you'll have to enter a different name. But the devs at DMA went one step further, having a dig at Nintendo's rivals. If the words Sonic or Sega are entered as names, the "not cool enough" prompt will also be triggered. Cheeky boys. This next piece of trivia reveals that Donkey Kong Country and Phil Collins actually had more in common than just gorillas. According to the game's composer, David Wise, he had actually been attempting to make the SNES emulate the sound of a Roland CR78 drum machine, the same machine utilized by Phil Collins for the song In the Air Tonight. The similarities between Donkey Kong Country soundtrack and Collins' song can be heard quite strikingly at the beginning of the game's track, Bayou Boogie. Interestingly, one fan of the game, who was musically inclined, had actually noticed this connection before David Wise even made this statement, a whole 5 years prior, when he made a mashup of the two songs to demonstrate their similarities. One small change had to be made to Chrono Trigger when the game was localized for English speakers. The change in question can be found during a side quest in the game where the player must travel back in time to try and save Luca's mother from an accident in waiting, which left her debilitated for life. In order to save her, the player must work out a password to the machine which is set to harm her, a password which winds up actually being her name. The player must input this password without the use of a password entry screen. So of course, using quick thinking, the player must come to realize that they need to type out the name by using the buttons on their controller. The left shoulder button for an L, the A button for an A, etc. Now, in the Japanese release of the game, Luca's mother is written in kanji, with no distinct way to spell this name using the Latin alphabet. Because of the similarities of L and R in Japanese, Luca's mother could actually have one of 4 different names: Lara, Lala, Rala, or Rara. The correct answer is Lala in the Japanese game, though knowing this answer would have been tough. It's a lot more straightforward in English because L and R are phonetically distinct, but the English localization team also changed the character's name to Lara, probably because it was the closest option that actually resembled a Western name. This also meant that the game had to be partially reprogrammed to accommodate this, as it meant the password required a different combination of button inputs. The localization team of Final Fantasy VI also had their hands full with the game's translation, particularly, it seems, with their desire to incorporate pop culture or real-world references into the game that audiences may recognize. Well, would have recognized back in the 90s, perhaps. Legends of Localization has compiled some of these references together, including a line which was likely referencing Beavis and Butthead, with a corporal saying, "Fire, fire, heh heh heh."
Fire, 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 fire.
Another reference comes with the 3 Dream Stooges, which, unsurprisingly, includes a reference to the 3 Stooges, sharing the names of Moe, Larry, and Curly. Another reference to popular TV viewing occurs in the last battle with Ultros, in which he calls in Typhon with the line, "Come on down," the famous catchphrase from hit game show The Price is Right. As perhaps a reference to something slightly older, however, one of the passwords for a boy in South Figaro during the Empire's occupation is Rosebud, a reference to the most prized possession of the protagonist from Citizen Kane.
Rosebud.
The next RPG we're talking about is Super Mario RPG, which also happens to have a ton of references within it, though notably far more in the Japanese version of the game. There was some excellent research done a few years ago by video game translator Clyde Mandelin, where he compared the English dialogue of many enemies to their Japanese counterparts, revealing that the English localization cut out many references to media. But there were a few other things lost in translations as well, direct references to Nintendo games and characters. In the English versions of Mario RPG, the Magic Koopa enemies will say, "That's my child?" when a battle starts. This is a bit odd, and seems to be a bare-bones translation of the text that pops up in the Japanese game. Here, the Magic Koopa says, "Kyuki, you're that baby from that one time." This is clearly a reference to Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island, where a Magic Koopa kidnaps baby Mario and Luigi, but drops Mario and tries to recapture him. It seems that the localization staff on Mario RPG didn't get the reference at all, and changed it to something similar, but generic without the original meaning. Another enemy in the game is Gorilla, not to be confused with Donkey Kong, of course. In the English version, this foe's opening text says, "Don't confuse me with someone else," a nod to the fact that this ape has a striking resemblance to DK. However, this is a toned-down version of the original Japanese text, which opens with, "This character has no relation to any persons living or dead. Any resemblance is purely coincidental." The intro text is worded as a legal disclaimer from the developers, rather than a statement from the character, which frankly is far funnier. Though to be fair, the legal disclaimer joke was probably dropped due to text character limitations. The enemy's name was also changed, with the Japanese name being Dosuke Yongu, which sounds like a bootleg version of how Donkey Kong is pronounced in Japanese. Donkey Kongu. When you think about piracy or anti-piracy measures in games, you probably think about PC gaming, the Nintendo DS or Game Boy Advance, or maybe even the Dreamcast or PlayStation. But one console that probably doesn't come to mind is the Nintendo 64. Due to the system using cartridges, pirated copies were more expensive to reproduce. This meant that pirates in the late 90s and early 2000s instead set their sights on the Dreamcast and PS1, as discs were a lot cheaper to reproduce. With that said, it wasn't as if developers just left their N64 games without any form of copy protection. Many N64 titles actually have anti-piracy, including titles like The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, and several titles made by Rare, such as Donkey Kong 64. So in this video, we'll be showing you some of the most noteworthy examples of anti-piracy measures in Nintendo 64 games, starting with the much-loved platformer collectathon Banjo-Tooie. Rare knew that Banjo-Kazooie was a hit with the Nintendo 64, and they wanted to make sure its sequel sold just as well, by introducing new anti-piracy measures. But we're sure the team didn't expect their efforts to be so effective that Tooie is often touted as the most copy-protected N64 title in the entire system's library. In fact, the ROM for Banjo-Tooie wasn't entirely cracked until December 2012, over 12 years after its release. Although Tooie could be played relatively issue-free on Nintendo 64 emulators on PC, prior to December 2012, the game wouldn't work properly on flash carts like the EverDrive. This is partly a result of the emulators being able to emulate boot chips and the like, but it's also due to the game having many anti-piracy checks. The first test occurs when the game is powered on, where it checks for the correct save type. Banjo-Tooie uses a 2KB EEPROM, but if the save type for the game is incorrect, or there simply is no save chip present on the game's cartridge, the game acts as if there's no controller plugged in. This means no buttons will respond, and a no controller message will display on screen. The second level of copy protection comes in the form of a CIC lockout chip, which the game checks for, with NTSC copies of the game checking to see if a CIC NUS 6105 chip is present, and PAL copies looking out for a CIC NUS 7105 chip. This check is done by using the challenge response feature found in these chips, which Banjo-Tooie makes heavy use of throughout gameplay, with 268 different checks in total. The responses from the CIC chip are used to decrypt files associated with the game's assets, so if any of these checks end up failing, the game can't decrypt the data, and will be unable to load a required asset into the game. This results in all manner of crashes, and since this happens hundreds of times throughout the game, it's essentially unplayable. If you're not familiar with Nintendo 64 anti-piracy,
and who'd blame you, you might be asking yourself, what the hell are these CIC chips the game uses? Well, it's a fascinating series of chips that many N64 games use for copy protection, including several more games in this video. So we're going to briefly explain how it works. CICs are boot chips. And ever since the NES and SNES, Nintendo had implemented CICs in their systems to curb piracy. However, it wasn't long before pirates worked out a means of circumventing the anti-piracy measures that utilized these chips, and so it became open for the masses to play downloaded ROMs. For the N64, Nintendo didn't stray too far from the measures they already knew, and continued to utilize CIC chips. However, Nintendo knew that these were simple to bypass, so a change in implementation was made. Instead of the N64 including a corresponding CIC chip, it instead used a PIF bus. This handled the system's initial boot code for the system, as well as handling controller inputs, but mostly it handles security on the console. It checks that a cartridge contains the correct CIC chip, thus checking if it's been pirated, and that it's a cartridge with the same region as the console. With the SNES, it became simple enough to disable the circuit which the CIC in both the cartridges and the system utilized, but the N64 now had a chip which handled multiple functions and didn't work in sync with the chip on the cartridge. This means that stopping the circuit the chip is running on would just result in games failing to boot entirely. This meant that N64 devices which ran backups would often require the use of a legitimate cartridge as well, in order to use the CIC chip located on the legitimate game. In total, there were 5 different CIC chips on cartridges per region, which meant that you'd need to use a game which utilized the correct chip for the game you wanted to run. This was a problem for people wanting to play Star Fox 64, for example, as it was the only game to use the CIC NUS 6101 chip on the cartridge, which meant you'd need a legitimate copy of Star Fox 64 in order to play a backup copy. Over time, many clever people worked out the deeper inner workings of both the CIC and the PIF, and ultimately came up with a means to get around their methods. We mentioned before that Banjo-Tooie had stringent copy protection, but this was typical of Rare, who would aggressively protect their games from piracy. While most companies simply put faith into Nintendo's built-in anti-piracy measures, Rare implemented additional security in most of their games. And Jet Force Gemini was one of these titles. If the game detected a different variant of the CIC chip than what is supposed to be included in the game, it would still boot, but during the game, all weapons would be disabled. If the player tried pressing the Z button to fire, they'll simply hold their weapon out and do nothing, meaning that it would be impossible to progress past the first Life Force door in Goldwood. Additionally, if the player is controlling Juno, they'll no longer be able to run and be forced to move through the world at an incredibly slow walk speed. Most N64 backup devices used the 6102 and 7102 variants of the CIC chip, because this was the most common CIC in N64 carts. But Jet Force Gemini used 6105 and 7105 variants, which made the game difficult to pirate successfully. This was more strict than Rare's earlier anti-piracy measures, but the methods used in earlier titles such as Diddy Kong Racing could still leave would-be pirates a little vexed. Diddy Kong Racing makes the typical checks for the correct CIC chip, but interestingly, if it finds a chip of a different iteration, the game will actually let the player progress to a race, with a catch. From there, they'll be subjected to the pause menu continuously appearing to disrupt gameplay. We say this is less strict because, technically, this does mean that the player could complete the game if they continuously unpaused it, but this would probably be excruciating to endure, or perhaps a great speedrun category to watch on Games Done Quick. Donkey Kong 64 was similarly not quite as harsh at preventing the player from making progress, but it wasn't exactly forgiving of pirates. If a different CIC chip than the one included in the retail cart is being used, the game will boot and play completely fine. The only problem is the player would have to be willing to leave their system on even when they're not playing, as the game will randomly delete save data from the cartridge during gameplay without warning. But these examples are fairly simple, deleting save data, stopping the game from booting, or preventing progress. What about some whacked out nonsense that makes pirates confused and flustered? Perfect Dark contains a huge number of piracy checks in its data, with some being pretty simple and some being pretty bizarre. all of the game's anti-piracy measures occur when specific actions are taken in-game, and if one of the checks fails to determine the title is running unmodified and legitimately, they will trigger. The first check occurs during the power-on phase, causing the game to simply never boot. Another check is made when opening the game's cheat menu, which will simply crash the game. When opening a door, the game will rewrite its code to prevent doors from opening. If a simulant picks up an item in multiplayer, all guards will suddenly be able to see the player through walls, and when a guard uncloaks, this disables the ability for the player, and other characters, from going up and down slopes. Another fun form of copy protection happens whenever a character throws a grenade, which will trigger an infinite number of explosions to spawn around the player. And not just that, but whenever there is an explosion, the game will then make all explosions massive. And if a player breaks glass, the game's audio frequency is modified to an incredibly high value, resulting in all characters sounding like chipmunks. Rare certainly got creative with this one, but Nintendo have also gotten a bit wild with their anti-piracy measures themselves. One of the biggest titles on the Nintendo 64, and the one most likely to be the shining jewel in a would-be pirate's sights, is The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Just like every other game we've mentioned, Zelda utilizes a check for the correct CIC lockout chip, and if a chip other than 6105 or 7105 is detected, several measures are put in place. One alteration is made with how the code manages the fishing minigame. This measure makes it so that fish from the pond at Lake Hylia always let go after being caught for 51 frames, about 2.5 seconds, making the fishing minigame impossible. This in particular seems like a strange piece of anti-piracy, as the fishing segment isn't needed to beat the game, and is only needed if you want to 100% complete it. That said, a different measure will absolutely stop you in your tracks. If you're playing a pirated game, the bars found in Ganon's castle which block the exits during the escape sequence might give you some trouble. Zelda will normally open these bars for the player, but if the wrong chip is detected, the bars will simply stay in place. Zelda, however, will not. But probably the most bizarre change to occur involves the 3D model for adult Zelda during cutscenes. This can first be seen during the cutscene in which Sheik's identity is revealed, where Sheik transforms back into Zelda to reveal her with a rather extreme slick-back puff hairstyle.
Hello, and welcome to Did You Know Gaming Extra. In this episode, we'll be exploring trivia for the hugely popular, or not so popular depending on where you live, Commodore Amiga. At the time of its release, the Amiga 1000 was one of the most advanced home computers on the market. The system sported a full multitasking operating system, capable of displaying 4096 colours and supporting full stereo sound. All of this at a time when most home PCs were maxing out at 8 colours and still bleeping away with their horrible little internal speaker. It was so groundbreaking, in fact, that in 2006 PC World rated the Amiga 1000 as the 7th greatest PC of all time. But that rating wasn't just for the system's hardware, it was for the software lineup too. One of the system's most memorable games was LucasArts' comedic pirate-based point-and-click adventure, The Secret of Monkey Island. The game had several revisions, and some of them were for reasons you might not expect. A joke existed in early versions of the game where the main character Guybrush could look at a statue in the voodoo shop. If the player used the look at command on the statue, Guybrush would say, "Looks like an emaciated Charles Atlas." LucasArts received a cease and desist letter because of this joke, likely from Charles Atlas Limited, which now represents the famous bodybuilder's brand after his death. As a result, the joke was removed from later versions of the game. Another popular Amiga title was Lemmings. The game was made by DMA Design, who now go by the name Rockstar. While developing Lemmings, DMA also made a level editor for the game based on the interface of the Amiga art package Deluxe Paint. Since the game's artists were already familiar with the interface, using it for the level editor meant they were able to create levels more easily. They'd even compete with one another to create the most difficult level designs they could. Unfortunately, this led to them having a large amount of hard levels, requiring them to go back and design easier ones for the start of the game. If we're showcasing games that defined the Amiga, we'd be doing a bad job of it if we didn't talk about the turn-based tactics game Worms. During the development period of Worms, the game went under the title Total Wormage. The name was parodying another popular game at the time called Total Carnage. Even the title font was similar. The game was made entirely by Andy Davidson in his spare time for fun, and wasn't renamed until Team 17 agreed to publish the title. They were so impressed with the game that they agreed to take it on after just a brief demonstration. Speaking of Team 17, their overhead sci-fi shooter Alien Breed contained not one, but two rather scathing messages buried in the game's files for any would-be pirates. The first reads,
"Stop it now, okay? You will gain nothing from breaking this protection, but I guess you're too ignorant, narrow-minded, or maybe even too stupid to understand that."
Before going on to decry what the writer refers to as leaders and spreaders, calling them nothing but leeches, and closing with,
"The scene today is perverted and led by ignorant, computer-illiterate idiots, only in it for the fame and money. They think they're famous and legendary, but nobody likes or admires them for sure. I hate it! Now I've realized the stupidity of my actions, and I wish I could undo them. You'll also do just that in a few years too if you have a conscience, and wish you had done something else. So don't crack it."
It's unknown for sure who left this message, but it was possibly written by Stefan Boberg, the game's creator, who left a second message. After a self-aggrandizing introduction, referring to himself as a computer god, it reads in part,
"Don't even think about it. Cracking is both illegal and immoral and will get you nowhere in this world. We have spent a lot of time doing this game, and we will not hesitate to take legal actions against those who duplicate this game illegally. We have complete overview over the cracking scene, and know your name and whereabouts, no doubt. We have prepared a nice surprise for you. You may think it is challenging, exciting, or even glorious to crack, but from our point of view it is nothing but theft and sabotage. You may have read or heard all this before, but this time it's different and real. We mean it. Think about it."
He goes on to say,
"If you still insist on being an ignorant, egocentric lowlife and go ahead cracking this, go ahead, try me. It won't be easy. It will be hard, damn close to impossible, destructive, and it will be so damn pointless."
before finally stating that,
"This protection is the toughest ever, unbreachable."
and signing off as,
"The creator of this, and plenty to come protections, Stefan Boberg."
Stepping away from hidden messages from frustrated developers, you might be surprised to learn that another company that now dominates the tech industry was also involved in the creation of the Amiga. Years before starting work on their own operating system, Microsoft was responsible for writing Amiga Basic. This was a programming language included with early versions of the Amiga OS that allowed programmers easy access to the Amiga's unique graphical and audio capabilities. Compute magazine, a popular programming publication, even included code for Amiga Basic that users could manually enter to compile various games and other programs for free, much as in the early 8-bit era. Unknown to many owners of the Amiga 1000, the computer contains a very unusual Easter egg, not hidden in the software, but instead physically built into the case design. On the inside of each plastic panel are the names of the development team that worked on the system, perhaps the most noteworthy name being J Minor, often referred to as the father of the Amiga. J Minor was known for always being accompanied by his dog Michi, a cockapoo who even had her own employee ID badge, and so fittingly, his beloved companion's paw print is also featured. It also seems clear that someone working on the Amiga was a big fan of the well-known new wave band, the B-52s, as many of the motherboards across the different models of the system had the names of different B-52 songs inscribed on them. The A500 had Rock Lobster, the A600 had Junebug, and the A1200 and A590 had Channel Z and Party Mix respectively. This theme ended with the release of the CD32, whose motherboard was instead inscribed with Spellbound, a song by Susie and the Banshees. This was not the only musical connection of the Amiga, however, as in 2007 Calvin Harris released his gold-selling album I Created Disco, including the hit song Acceptable in the 80s, all recorded in a home studio using a then 15-year-old Amiga 1200. The Amiga was also used to create music for games on entirely different platforms. Japanese studio Game Freak, for example, used an Amiga to compose the music for Pokemon Gold and Silver before converting it to the correct format for use on the Game Boy Color. The Amiga has had a number of celebrity fans, including both Dick Van Dyke and Andy Warhol, the latter of whom was even there to demonstrate the impressive graphical power of the first model at its unveiling. One celebrity fan, however, went a step further, being actively involved in developing new software and hardware for the system. Will Wheaton, after finishing his role as Wesley Crusher in Star Trek The Next Generation, went on to work for Newtek and helped to develop the Video Toaster 4000. This was a more advanced version of the Amiga's video editing software and hardware, which was used to produce special effects for TV programs such as The Tonight Show, Sequest, and the first season of Babylon 5. On top of that, the promotional video for the Video Toaster 4000 featured not only Will Wheaton, but also fellow toaster owners Penn Jillette and Tony Hawk. And now it's time for this episode's random piece of trivia. Today, we're going to take a look at the Dragon Ball Z collectible CD picture cards. These were a series of multimedia pocket CD-ROMs released exclusively in Australia in 2001. The odd-shaped discs were compatible with both PC and Macintosh. They were designed and produced by Stream Media Limited, who created 10 versions of the collectible CDs. Each disc featured a different character and was also available randomly in packets and as a promotional giveaway with the purchase of Coca-Cola products. Each disc also contained information on the respective character on the label, as well as the info on each Dragon Ball Z saga up to the Cell saga. They also had information on merchandise and featured a battle print activity mode, which let the user arrange art assets to make a scene. Despite saying DBZ Set 1 on the packaging, no additional series were ever released.
DC Comics superheroes have a long lineage in the medium of video games, with some adaptations like the Batman Arkham series proving hugely popular. For some members of the DC library, on the other hand, success has eluded them. In the case of Green Lantern, it wasn't until 2011 that the character finally received their own video game. This came in the form of Green Lantern Rise of the Manhunters, a tie-in to the Green Lantern movie starring Ryan Reynolds. This beat 'em up by Double Helix Entertainment, which was built from the remnants of a cancelled Justice League fighting game, underperformed much like the movie that inspired it. That was by no means the first attempt to translate the character into video game form, however. That honour belonged to the once prominent UK developer Ocean Software, who was producing a Green Lantern game for the SNES in the early 1990s. For decades, the unreleased project has remained largely shrouded in mystery, with memories of it being kept alive by archived magazine scans and enthusiast websites picking up the pieces. Thanks to the tireless efforts of game historians, namely Frank Gasking, the creator of Games That Weren't, much of the game's history has at last been demystified. In 2019, Frank's search to preserve Ocean's Lost project bore fruit as he recovered a prototype cartridge from the project. As a result of this discovery, in partnership with Games That Weren't, we can now exclusively bring you the world's first glimpse of the game in motion. In this installment of Game History Secrets, I'll be exploring the history of Ocean Software's Green Lantern and why the game never came to be. Ocean Software was a studio based in Manchester, England, founded in 1983. The company initially made its name developing clones and conversions of popular arcade games for home computers, such as Donkey Kong. It was a bit later into the decade that Ocean Star would truly rise, however, as they entered the business of license games. One of their breakout hits using this approach arrived in 1987. They took a chance on a little-known Hollywood script about a cybernetically altered police officer, purchasing the rights to adapt it into a video game prior to its release. RoboCop would go on to become one of the biggest movies of the year, and Ocean's gamble paid off for them hugely. They were able to get their adaptation of the movie out within the same year, allowing them to quickly recoup the relatively small amount paid for the license. The game was very well received, and the studio had a monster hit on its hands, as it dominated UK sales charts for over a year. Ocean's success opened the door to bigger, more established names. The studio partnered with Warner Bros. To produce a tie-in game to the 1989 Batman movie for home computers. Capitalizing upon hype around the film once again, the game sold well, further solidifying their strong working relationship with WB. Ocean's numerous Batman games paved the way to them gaining greater access to DC's back catalogue in the early 1990s. The company took an interest in a number of properties around this time, first Watchmen, followed by Lobo, and Green Lantern. The latter would end up becoming their focus, and by 1991, a Green Lantern game entered the preliminary stages of development at Ocean Software. At this point, it was being planned for the Commodore Amiga and Atari ST. Ideas were fluid, but cast Hal Jordan as the playable Green Lantern of choice. This sketch of the character, drawn by artist Mike Marshall, was one of the earliest examples of pen being put to paper on the project. It was created as part of an internship that Marshall had arranged at Ocean's Manchester offices. The project was worked on for no more than a few months before being put on ice. By all indications, the developers were struggling to come up with a solid design plan for the Amiga and ST platforms. It was shelved accordingly with the intention of one day revisiting it. That day eventually arrived a couple of years later. By 1993, Ocean had pivoted to home console development and had a number of titles in the works for the SNES. Among them was a tie-in game inspired by the live-action Dennis the Menace movie, which launched just in time for the holiday season. Programmer Andrew Deacon and artist Ivan Horn were frequent collaborators at Ocean who had worked together on the game, and now found themselves in search of their next project. They would soon be paired up again, this time for a revived Green Lantern project being overseen by Gary Bracey, Ocean's VP of Development and resident comic book enthusiast. The company's management had made the decision to bring it back on the Super Nintendo. Its improved graphical capabilities over older hardware allowed for more creative freedom, and they had already developed technology that could be used for Green Lantern. Recycling platforming code from Dennis the Menace, Green Lantern was predominantly a side-scrolling platformer with puzzle elements. Pulling right from the comics, Green Lantern's ring could project all manner of different shapes and objects to battle enemies and aid in progression, such as a giant green anvil. Their Green Lantern of choice was again Hal Jordan, the main Green Lantern in the comics at this time. The game's plot pulled from an obscure area of the source material that had only been briefly touched upon in a 1963 story called The Green Lantern Disasters. In it, Hal Jordan travels to the distant world of Zeos, a planet of intelligent insects which is home to a grasshopper-like Green Lantern named Zax. Hal finds Zeos under the thumb of a gang of bugs which has seized the planet's food supply of sugar and helps Zax defeat them. While Zax would go on to very occasionally appear in other Green Lantern media, this was, prior to 1993, the only instance in which his homeworld Zeos was shown. Regardless, it was this little known corner of the DC universe around which Ocean decided to base their game's story. In the Green Lantern game, the Queen of Zeos threatens the fate of the universe when she sends her army of insectoid creatures to obtain a series of mythical crystals. If she is successful, the artifacts will grant them invincibility, allowing them to rule over existence unchallenged. The Green Lantern sets out to stop her, traversing various alien worlds on his way to Zeos itself to defeat her. The Zeos Queen is said to have been a fully original character that was inspired by the Queen from the 1986 sci-fi movie Aliens. The game was planned to transition between different genres of gameplay, mixing platforming levels with vertical and horizontal shoot-'em-up stages, in addition to sections which leveraged the system's Mode 7 capabilities. In these parts, players would maneuver the hero as he flies over a moonscape environment, evading and returning fire in forward-facing aerial combat. Its variety was a result of the disjointed manner in which the game was built. Separate small groups of people throughout Ocean's offices made each section individually before connecting them later in development. This slapdash approach was typical for the company at the time. Their games often followed only a loose outline, being formed in different groups and pieced together later on. It was this approach that some commentators believe was to the project's detriment and contributed to it never seeing the light of day.
The reason why it fell apart, it was because of the mismanagement. There was no clear plan, I'd say, from the start. I think in the old days of Ocean, they kind of had that winging it mentality where they chuck stuff together. They used to put games together in like 2 or 3 weeks sometimes if there was a Christmas deadline. But on the smaller platforms, you could get away with that. But I think as you got onto platforms, 16-bit platforms, it was much harder to do. And Green Lantern didn't really have a clear game design document. There wasn't a clear plan they were following. They were making it up. And I think that caused problems because they were chucking stuff in which didn't really fit.
For the time being, the game chugged along regardless into 1994, when, early into the year, it was disrupted by some big changes being made to the property at DC. The comic book giant had observed a slump in sales of Green Lantern and began plotting out a significant shake-up in order to renew interest in the series. These plans came into play when Hal Jordan's home Coast City was eviscerated by the supervillain duo of Mongol and Cyborg Superman. Overcome by grief, Hal later attempts in vain to recreate his lost home by using his power ring, but surmises that a larger energy source will be required in order to accomplish his goal. His grief twists into madness, sending him on a rampage across the universe, slaughtering his fellow Green Lanterns along the way. He eventually arrives at the Green Lantern Corps HQ, where he wipes out all but one of the Guardians of the Universe and steals their main source of power. He emerges from the experience as the villain Parallax. Ganthert, the last surviving Guardian, travels to Earth and entrusts a ring of power to an unassuming freelance artist named Kyle Rayner. This controversial storyline, named Emerald Twilight, ran throughout the first months of 1994. It turned the star of Ocean's game from hero to villain and was plotted out entirely without their knowledge. This meant that the team had to suddenly replace Hal Jordan with Kyle Rayner as the protagonist mid-development, a mandate handed down to them by DC with no prior warning. Parallax would later become reworked into a boss character that Kyle would have fought partway through the story. Following these changes, the title was reported to have had a small presence at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show of 1994. It also appeared in game magazines shortly thereafter. It was expected to be released in late 1994, according to the information supplied to these outlets. For this brief space of time, development was seemingly going smoothly, but as the year went on, the game's fate was cast into uncertainty. In mid-1994, Gary Bracey, Ocean's VP of Development, resigned from the company amid rumours of a possible takeover. Fearing a change in Ocean's workplace culture, he left before Green Lantern was completed. Over the years, many have given credit to Bracey's leadership as a key factor in Ocean's success. His departure set the stage for some of the difficulties that would follow. Green Lantern's SNES game was, according to former Ocean staff, finished on schedule by late 1994. A soundtrack had been recorded in full by Dean Evans, the studio's resident composer, and a bombastic conclusion to the story had been mapped out. Players would have infiltrated the outer rim of Zeos in an R-Type-esque horizontal shooting section before descending beneath the planet's surface to eventually confront the Queen in a final boss sequence. The game was awaiting testing when it was rocked once more by external forces. In September of that year, DC kicked off another world-altering event that was heavily based around the Green Lantern characters. 0 Hour Crisis in Time was a massive crossover storyline which had major implications for the entire DC universe. Hal Jordan, aka Parallax, used his newfound powers to reset the universe from scratch in the hopes of restoring Coast City and those who had perished. DC used this premise to wipe the slate clean, undoing certain past events and laying the groundwork for the future. This was another major development in the comic books that licensees Ocean Software had no prior knowledge of, but one which they would have to quickly adapt to in order for their game to see the light of day. DC instructed them that the game would need to be reworked to be set after the events of 0 Hour. This meant removing and/or changing characters from the previous version of the DC universe, such as Parallax. The changes needed to get it up to code were apparently significant, and Ocean Software's remaining management weren't keen to implement them. Despite it being very close to the finish line, a decent investment was still required to give it the refresh it needed. By late 1994, Ocean had concerns that the Super Nintendo's expiration date was drawing near. Weighing this up with the costs of revamping the game led them to shelving the project. Within a short space of time, the Green Lantern video game had gone from briefly being considered content complete to outright cancelled. The decision was made as part of a shift in priorities for Ocean Software, whose management was intending to phase out the development of 2D games and focus on 3D ones. This was met with some dissent from two key employees, programmer Andrew Deacon and artist Ivan Horn. As Frank Gasking explains, this creative disagreement quickly escalated with severe consequences.
Ivan and Andrew weren't particularly happy about that. They kind of voiced their concerns about it. It wasn't a great idea. And then the next thing they know, they're basically let go. They no longer have jobs, so they're gone, essentially. And that they were completely shocked by that. So by the sounds of it, they took their code with them. They didn't actually leave any remains of it at Ocean.
For a few weeks, the fate of Ocean's Green Lantern appeared to be resolved, when, against the odds, the company chose to revive it. Bobby Earl, a programmer at the studio, had requested additional work hours in order to fund a mortgage deposit on a new house. After weighing up their options, Ocean went back on their previous call and placed him in charge of revamping their Green Lantern SNES game. Earl spent his usual hours at Ocean developing Silver, an RPG for PC. When the working day ended for most other employees, he switched over to Green Lantern. As the lone programmer on the project, and Andrew Deakin's code effectively gone, Earl had to rebuild much of the game himself. But there were still plenty of assets from the previous iteration he had access to. Large swaths of the art were reused, such as backgrounds, and the musical score from Dean Evans was brought back too. This new version of the project, seen here in motion for the first time, was built using the engine from Ocean's Jurassic Park 2 game. This side-scrolling shooter was a fresh take on the property that endeavoured to be more faithful to the comic books in the hopes of appeasing DC's higher-ups. The game's planned opening is particularly indicative of this approach. The team constructed a highly detailed cutscene which painstakingly recreated a sequence from the comics in which Kyle Rayner first gained possession of his ring. The dialogue is lifted off the page almost verbatim, a sign of their renewed commitment to the source material. Gone was the original story of Zeos and its power-hungry queen, replaced with an attempt to more directly adapt Rayner's origins into video game form. The first level would have seen him navigating a particularly dangerous Los Angeles street, blasting gun-toting thugs with his ring. As opposed to generating a series of different shapes with the ring, as you did in the previous version, the game simplified its functionality to a projectile weapon. It could be upgraded into a series of increasingly more devastating green firearms, such as a rocket launcher via power-ups. After making his way through the mean streets, the Green Lantern was intended to come up against a first boss. This was based around the first villain Kyle encounters in the comics, an unnamed man in a mech suit who is wreaking havoc and attempting to siphon off the city's power supply. The boss battle was seemingly never finished. This third iteration of the project dispensed with the shoot-'em-up levels and Mode 7 stages and chose to focus on making a side-scrolling shooter with elements of platforming. Some other variety sections were planned, but the specifics of them were yet to be determined. For a few months, a skeleton team tinkered away on the project in around late 1994 through into 95. This consisted primarily of Bobby Earl and a few artists including John Ritzer and Ray Coffey. This small group allowed Ocean to redo Green Lantern according to DC specifications with less of a financial commitment, and having Bobby Earl develop it outside of work hours meant that resources were less impacted. These positives, however, couldn't ultimately offset the concerns that Ocean's higher-ups had held previously. The Super Nintendo was well into its twilight years by this point, and the company's trepidations about releasing new games on it were only growing. With the PlayStation set to arrive in the West later that year, and Nintendo's home console also looming, time was running out for Ocean's Green Lantern on the SNES. Realizing the potential for diminished sales, Ocean finally pulled the plug on the project for good. John Lomax, an artist who briefly worked on Green Lantern, put it thusly. Ocean decided it wouldn't make enough additional revenue above their marketing and development costs to continue any further. The reboot of the project just compounded the problem. Former employees indicate that the game still had a decent amount of development time ahead of it. A few different levels were mapped out, but remained largely incomplete. The game would have eventually portrayed different worlds beyond Earth, including one crawling with alien mercenaries. Some of the music written for the game was re-implemented in another ocean game, Waterworld, for the SNES. In 2011, Dean Evans posted his Green Lantern soundtrack on YouTube. The project's demise represented the beginning of the end for Ocean's relationship with DC Comics. A year after its cancellation, the company axed a fighting game based around Lobo, which was being made for the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo. Years later, the Green Lantern game slipped into relative obscurity, before Frank Gasking's research finally uncovered the truth about its development, which was first published in his book, The Games That Weren't. Frank's efforts also brought to light a prototype cartridge from the end of development, recovered from former Ocean staffer Roy Fielding in 2019. You can learn more about the Green Lantern game in the Games That Weren't book and at gamesthatweren't.com. It's been called one of the worst and most offensive games ever made. Originally released to little fanfare in 1995, Hong Kong 97 later found new life on the internet amid the rise of video game emulation software. Its cult status was elevated further as it received coverage from the games media and a certain popular internet video series. It was an unlicensed shoot-'em-up game made for the Super Famicom by a writer going under the name Kowloon Kurosawa. It took aim at the Chinese government in a deliberately crude and provocative send-up of the game industry. Despite its online infamy, the circumstances surrounding its development have remained fairly obscure, save for people like Chris Shimon, aka the ultra-healthy video game nerd, who has developed a fascination with chronicling its history and has even gotten to know the game's reclusive creator. That's why he'll be lending his input throughout this video. Who were the people behind Hong Kong 97, and what of the culture that gave birth to it? This is just some of what we'll be exploring as we delve into the dark underground world of piracy in Japan and the creation of this twisted cult legend. Kowloon Kurosawa is the pseudonym adopted by a Japanese author, game developer, and businessman. Kurosawa grew up as an eager gamer in the 1980s, avidly playing through anything he could get his hands on at the dawn of the home computing industry. Money was tight, leading him to seek alternative means to feed his hobby.
He grew up as hardcore a gamer as you could be, having limited amount of money and being in, Japan in the late 70s, early 80s. A lot of the information and stuff was more in the West. It was more outside of Japan. So he was kind of like focused on looking for games outside of Japan from a young age. Where that led him to was, because, we're in Japan, he could go to Southeast Asia and buy copied Amiga games and copied DOS games. And that was where he found this Magicom thing.
The Super Magicom was a device produced by a small Taiwanese company named Front Far East. It was an unlicensed add-on for the Super Famicom that circumvented Nintendo's piracy protections, allowing users to copy their games to floppy disks and conversely enabling them to play games stored on floppies using their consoles. These gadgets helped to open the door for a whole market of pirated Super Nintendo games and unlicensed original titles. The Super Magicom became so ubiquitous in some parts of Asia that the name Magicom became an accepted blanket term for any game copying device, regardless of brand. For Kurosawa, this would be just the first of many forays into the illicit. In the mid-90s, he gained notoriety on the early internet when he founded his own bulletin board system, a server for exchanging files and messages. The BBS, known as Tokyo Isonet, was a virtual Wild West brimming with illegal activity. Kurosawa would bolster his cred in this underground world of piracy further through his regular contributions to an infamous Japanese gaming magazine named Game Urara. This short-lived publication ran for just 6 issues and was a monument to all things taboo. Each issue was packed with tips and guides on pirating and hacking games, among other much seedier and less safe for work topics. For one, the outlet maintained a fascination with the doomsday cult Aum Shinrikyo, which was responsible for the 1995 Tokyo subway sarin gas attack that claimed the lives of 13 people and injured thousands more. The magazine commonly wrote about the cult in a derisive manner, but undoubtedly served to bring more publicity to their operations regardless. One edition of the magazine featured electronic stores owned and operated by Arm in Japan, which sold pirated and hacked video games at low prices. It was able to do this because its staff were essentially slaves, devotees of the cult working without pay. Another issue of Gamerara contained an investigation of the cult's BBS server and the free software and games available on it. Furthermore, the magazine discussed a PC-98 video game based around Arm named The Story of Kamakushiki Village. This highly controversial release was falsely rumoured for many years to have been made as propaganda by the cult, with some even believing it was developed as an attempt at mind control. In actuality, it was a satirical cult management simulator that was created by associates of Kowloon Kurosawa. Speaking to Vice News in 2019, Kurosawa claimed that the experience of seeing Arm members run for public office in Japan left him and his friends shocked. The experience inspired them to create their own video games in an act of defiance and mockery against the cult as their influence continued to spread. The story of Kamakushiki Village became the most well-known of these following its launch in summer 1995, just a few months after the cult's attacks in Tokyo. Its development was attributed to Happy Soft Limited, the company owned and operated by Kowloon Kurosawa that also created Hong Kong 97 that same year. And so we begin to understand the environment in which Hong Kong 97 was made. It came from the mind of someone who was deeply entrenched in a world of degeneracy and had no qualms with pushing the boundaries of taste. On an early unregulated Japanese internet, his BBS, made when he was still just a child in junior high school, facilitated untold levels of criminal activity. His writing explored Japan's darkest recesses and was remorseless in its promotion of piracy. On top of that, Kurosawa was coming of age in a climate of political hysteria as paranoia about Arm and other threats loomed large in the media. But there was something more personal that played a role in motivating the creation of Hong Kong 97 too. As of early 1995, Kurosawa had begun to harbour resentment towards the video game industry. His ambitions of entering legitimate game development were failing to materialise, and worse yet, his business of selling Magicoms was effectively stamped out by Nintendo. The tech giant's lawyers tracked Kurosawa down in the mid-90s and put a stop to his activities with a cease and desist letter. In addition to this, any hope he had of independently developing for the Super Famicom through official channels was extinguished as he learned of Nintendo's rigorous content policies and licensing fees. Rejected by an industry that had once inspired him and swatted down by one of its biggest names, Kurosawa channeled his dissatisfaction into a new bootleg game project. He leveraged a recently acquired contact in the games industry to make it a reality. A programmer with an interest in the underground world of game piracy had taken notice of Kurosawa's work and wrote to him, offering his praise and services. The individual in question, who prefers to remain anonymous, was a developer who had worked with companies such as Square.
So this person contacted Kurosawa and was like, let's make a game together. I want to make something with your mad genius. And that was the beginning of Hong Kong 97, basically. So Kurosawa just came up with just, the most ravenous, just offensive thing he could possibly think of.
While Nintendo's licensing terms prohibited them from developing for the Super Famicom officially, the Magicom presented a path forward. Their game would be burnt to floppy disks and sold to Magicom users, allowing it to ultimately be played on the Super Famicom. In early 1995, the project's very brief production was carried out. Even during this era, some games required months upon months of planning before any code could be written. For Hong Kong 97, on the other hand, it was drafted out and cobbled together within just a few hours. Kurosawa lifted stolen assets from almost anything he had to hand. A movie poster, second-hand laserdiscs, an old CD, anything even vaguely suitable found in his apartment would be combined in this cacophony of copyright infringement. While Kurosawa effectively directed the game, dictating its content, his new industry friend was responsible for programming it. As the game boots up, players are greeted with an appeal from the developers to join their business of illegally copying and reselling Super Nintendo games. Players are encouraged to submit their Magicom copy titles with the incentive that they will receive a third of the profits from any units sold. The game even presents Happysoft's business address for any interested parties to contact them. Immediately following this is the game's opening cinematic told by still digitized images and blocks of text. The story portrays a bleak near-future 1997, in which China assumes control of Hong Kong and crime rates subsequently skyrocket. The player controls Chin, a fictional relative of martial arts legend Bruce Lee, who is tasked by Hong Kong's government with wiping out the population of mainland China in retaliation. However, China is in the process of transforming its dead former leader, Tong Xiaoping, a parody of Deng Xiaoping, into the ultimate weapon, the title scene warns. That, in a nutshell, is the narrative of Hong Kong 97. It was a satirical forecast from 1995 of what would result from the transfer of sovereignty over Hong Kong from the British to the Chinese, which was set to occur in 1997. In some ways, it reflected widespread concerns that the anticipated handover would be to the detriment of Hong Kong, but a pointed political message this was not. According to those familiar with Kurosawa, this twisted vision of his, filled with overt racism against the Chinese, was never intended as propaganda.
There is absolutely no manifesto to it at all. I think he is just looking at things and then just becomes a mirror for them. In his writing, in his videos, his documentaries. He just lets those things just be what they are. I don't think that he's thinking deeply about communism is the evil that we, the good people in the democratic nations, need to fight against and take down to save humanity. I don't think that he's thinking anything on that level. He loves Asia. He spends at least half his life there. His life is spent bouncing back and forth just between Japan and Southeast Asia.
Hong Kong 97 took the form of a basic vertical shoot-'em-up. The player must guide Chin out of the way of oncoming enemies, of which there are many, and can destroy them by firing bullets. The game uses a one-hit kill system, and any time Chin dies, the player is booted back to the title screen and forced to sit through the entire opening sequence once again. Another wrinkle worthy of note is that every time the player dies, the game displays an uncensored, digitized photograph of a dead body used to represent Chin. A smaller version of the same picture also appears when any standard enemy is defeated after a brief graphic of a mushroom cloud. The origin of this image has long been the subject of debate online. One prominent theory alleged that the body belonged to a Polish boxer whose death matched the date stamp seen in the picture. However, evidence has since emerged to suggest otherwise. In truth, the image originates from Death File, an obscure series of snuff films that contained graphic images of dead bodies. The third edition of Death File shows the gruesome aftermath of a battle that took place within the first months of the Bosnian War. It was from this tape that Kowloon Kurosawa lifted the infamous dead body image. The corpse belonged to a Bosniak civilian who was killed in the conflict.
It really was just something captured from a VHS he had. Like he had said, that's all it is. It's sorry to, break all of these fun theories that people have made. And kind of one ironic thing about it is that particular video is probably the rarest edition of the Death File series. It's not been put on DVD. It only exists on VHS, like some of the others. I've never seen one for sale anywhere.
This was just one of many unauthorized digitized photos Hong Kong 97 made use of. Others included shots of the Chinese Communist Party leadership and an ad for Coca-Cola. The game uses these as backgrounds during gameplay and switches between them each time the player dies. Furthermore, images of the actor Jackie Chan from the 1984 movie Wheels on Meals were used to represent the main character Chin. Equally as infamous as these is the game's one and only piece of music, I Love Beijing Tiananmen, a communist anthem written by the Chinese government. Due to the Super Nintendo's storage restrictions, a mere 6 seconds of the song was sampled by Kurosawa for Hong Kong 97. With a healthy dose of irony, it is played on a constant, unceasing loop throughout the game from its title screen onwards. It is the only audio that can be heard during it. No other music or sound effects were used.
The song is originally a sort of children's song that the Chinese Communist government wrote to get people to forget about the Tiananmen Square massacre. The lyrics just say, "I love Tiananmen Square, the sun rises over Tiananmen." And that version of it, it's a pop song version of that song. And he had it on a Laserdisc for some reason. And he just sampled up to however much data he could squeeze into that game.
The game lasts only several minutes for those who are able to make it through its bombardment of hazards and enemy fire. After a few minutes of regular shoot-'em-up gameplay, its first and only boss appears, the aforementioned ultimate weapon, which is the disembodied head of deceased communist leader Deng Xiaoping. The head floats about the screen attempting to slam down on the player, and after sustaining a certain level of damage it is defeated and standard gameplay resumes. The game runs on an infinite loop and lacks an ending of any kind. According to Kurosawa, he put together the materials for the game, including graphics and music, over the course of only a couple of hours. It was then sent off to his programmer, who did their part separately. It is said that this individual used technology stolen from a major game publisher to bring it to life.
That person, the mystery programmer, he used the base engine of another game that he had worked on at a major company.
Are you able to say which major company that was?
Almost certainly Enix.
Okay. Do you have any hunch, like, which game the engine might have been made for originally?
Unfortunately, I can't say that publicly. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay, but you know.
I know.
Okay.
You will know because you'd be able to find out immediately who it is.
Hong Kong 97 was unleashed upon the world in April 1995. Paid downloads of the game were available via Kurosawa's BBS server, and a very limited run of physical copies was sold in Game Urara. In the first edition of the magazine, the only known advertisement for the title can be found. Fewer than 100 copies were produced according to Kurosawa, but only around 30 or 40 were actually sold. The remainder were later destroyed. It was an unceremonious release that garnered little buzz outside of the director's immediate circles. Only a very small amount of money was made off the game, and for many years the project was largely forgotten about by those responsible for it. In the years that followed, Kurosawa continued to pursue his fascination with the depraved and explicit, travelling to Cambodia to document the illicit activities of his fellow tourists. Anything scandalous, sensationalist or illegal, he would write up in his various columns and books. His time working on video games was not over, however. In 2002, he privately developed another unlicensed title in a manner similar to how Hong Kong 97 was made, and much like that game, it was inspired by another sensitive political topic. The player controlled a boat manned by North Korean spies, tasked with approaching the shores of Japan and kidnapping civilians with the intention of ferrying them to North Korea for intelligence purposes. This was based upon the very real phenomenon of North Korean agents abducting Japanese citizens, which occurred throughout the 1970s and 80s. In typical Kurosawa fashion, the subject was treated with little sensitivity, and the game was practically designed to offend, so much so that he shied away from releasing it, anticipating a backlash.
I think after making it, he was just like, and this is going to get me so much flack. So he just never showed anyone.
So that was more offensive, in his opinion, than Hong Kong 97?
Yes, apparently.
In the mid-2000s, he returned to the field again, this time in a more official capacity than ever before. Kurosawa partnered with the very same programmer he had made Hong Kong 97 with to create a new game for the PlayStation 2. D3 was a Japanese game publisher responsible for the Simple series, a line of low-budget titles made in a matter of months. D3 had been searching for someone to helm an ongoing project in the Simple series, and Kurosawa's name was put forward by his contact. The project was named Miniskirt Police, or The Miniskirt Police, a game about policewomen whose clothes gradually degrade and fall off as they take damage. While this sleazy premise was on brand for Kurosawa's work, he has since insisted that the core idea was already in place when he joined the project. His contributions to its creative direction included, in his own words, ripping off the gameplay from Rockstar's Manhunt, a popular title from that generation. It became a 3D beat-em-up where players assumed the role of a female Special Forces member fighting a criminal organization about to flood the market with a potent new drug. A decade on from Hong Kong 97, he at last received some slither of recognition from the industry as he was able to release his first ever officially licensed video game. But it wouldn't be the last time his contributions to the medium would garner attention. Although Hong Kong 97 was far from a commercial success, the game began to be traded among enthusiasts at the dawn of emulation software. The ROM began circulating online throughout the 2000s, thanks in no small part to the way it was originally distributed, via internet downloads and floppy disks. Its notoriety would reach a crescendo, however, in 2015 as this obscure gaming legend was featured on the popular internet series The Angry Video Game Nerd. Worldwide interest in the game soared, as millions of people watched the nerd lampoon Kurosawa's magnum opus. There were more eyes on Hong Kong 97 than ever before, and this led to a new generation of people curiously digging into its history. This included Chris Shimon, who discovered the game via the AVGN, inspiring him to hunt down one of the only remaining physical copies in existence via Yahoo auctions. This copy was later verified by Kurosawa himself, as Chris became familiar with the enigmatic creator and even met him in person. For years, people have wondered what drove him to make Hong Kong 97. Was it spite, a political agenda, prejudices? The motivations behind its creation are something even Kurosawa himself struggles to express, according to Chris.
I mean, isn't that, it's very interesting. So I've met him a few times and we've developed, almost you could say a friendship. And I really understand that after a while, it's like, he's not so capable of verbalizing that. It's just, he's fascinated by the macabre, just anything that just seems out of the ordinary or daring or on the edge of legality. He was just fascinated by anything shocking, basically. Just anything, that was illegal or, just nasty or daring. It's what you would kind of call an edgelord. Yes, it's a shitpost, but its existence is a miracle. It's a Super Famicom game. You know what I mean? It is. It's a Super Nintendo game. It didn't come on a cart, but it runs on Super Nintendo hardware. And in that context, I think just what was the worst thing he could possibly do? Make a video game that has no respect whatsoever for any kind of copyright, any people's images, any kind of political correctness. Use digitized images of dead bodies from the Holocaust, right? It's just anything he could possibly get away with within that small span.
There are some motives that we can ascertain as to why this game was made, but its nature as an inexplicable oddity is a big part of why people have curiously held onto it for so long, and why it transcended its obscure roots in the Japanese bootleg market. On top of that, its implementation of an English language option, unusual for games of its ilk, allowed it to travel the world and find a second life in the West. Like so many of Kurosawa's works, it was made to do little other than provoke and grab the attention of audiences, and for better or worse, that is undoubtedly something it succeeded in doing decades on from release.
Resident Evil.
Did you know? Resident Evil was originally commissioned as a spiritual successor to a Capcom game for the Nintendo Famicom called Sweet Home. Sweet Home was based on a Japanese horror movie of the same name and was never released outside of Japan due to the game's graphic content. Sweet Home featured zombies, elaborate puzzles, scattered notes revealing plot elements, and most notably, door-opening loading sequences, all of which were later found in Resident Evil. Much like Sweet Home, early concepts for Resident Evil involved the use of paranormal enemies instead of living creatures. However, this was later changed to zombies, inspired by the renowned horror director George A. Romero and his movies such as Dawn of the Dead. Capcom actually hired Romero to direct a series of live-action commercials for Resident Evil 2, and later signed a deal with Universal Studios to have George Romero write and direct the Resident Evil live-action movies. Romero stated in an official appearance in Universal Studios Talk City that he had his secretary play through the entire game while he took notes of the experience. When Romero's script was finished and turned in, Capcom actually disapproved of it. In an interview with Electronic Gaming Monthly, Capcom producer Yoshiki Okamoto explained that Romero's script wasn't good, so Romero was fired. The job was then given to Paul Anderson, resulting in the current Resident Evil movie series we have today. An early draft of Resident Evil's story had two supporting characters that are absent from the final version of the game. Gelzer, a large muscular man with a cybernetic eye, and Dewey, a supposed comic relief character modeled after Eddie Murphy. Though these characters were cut, the name Dewey was given to an unrelated member of STARS named Edward Dewey. It's likely that the concepts for Gelzer and Dewey were reused in Capcom's later survival horror game Dino Crisis with the characters Gale and Rick, who both greatly resemble Gelzer and Dewey in appearance and personality. Biohazard, the Japanese version of Resident Evil, was actually meant to have Japanese voice acting for the dialogue, but this was cut and replaced with English voices. In a publication by Capcom called The True Story Behind Biohazard, series creator Shinji Mikami stated, "We also recorded Japanese voices, not just English ones. They were discarded because they were really lame." Ironic though, considering that Resident Evil's voice acting is considered some of the worst in the history of gaming, and was actually featured in the 2008 Guinness World Records Gamers Edition for the worst game dialogue ever. Throughout development of the series, several Resident Evil projects were halted by Capcom before they were finished. After the initial release of Resident Evil, the game was ported to the Game Boy Color. The port was announced in 1999 as a direct conversion of the PlayStation game, and was being developed by UK developer Hot Gen Studios. Even though around 90% of the game had already been completed, Capcom canceled the game in 2000, stating, "We're not confident that the product would have made both consumers and Capcom happy." In 2012, the game's ROM was leaked online and made available to the public by a collector from AssemblerGames.com. Resident Evil 3 originally began development as a completely different game, and was planned to star the masked mercenary Hunk from Resident Evil 2 as he tried to locate a G-Virus sample. What eventually became Resident Evil 3 was a separate spin-off project developed concurrently with Resident Evil 3 called Biohazard Gaiden. Biohazard Gaiden also shouldn't be confused with the Game Boy Color title Resident Evil Gaiden. That's a completely different game altogether. Another cancelled Resident Evil game was a spin-off known as Biohazard Dash. In an interview in the Japanese magazine Genki PlayStation, Capcom producer Yoshiki Okamoto had this to say about the game. "The starting point of the scenario is that there exists a room underneath the Tyrant's incubation. The story of the game unfolds 3 years after the events of Biohazard 1. The characters are different, and this time, infected plants have attacked the inhabitants of Raccoon City. The victims have changed partially into plants. It's as if everyone is slowly transforming into some plant." Biohazard Dash was set to use many of the same areas from the first game, but with spiderwebs and cracks to indicate that time had passed. Ultimately though, the game was cancelled to direct more focus on the development of Resident Evil 2. Capcom's Onimusha series was created after the cancellation of yet another Resident Evil game. Sengoku Biohazard was set in the Resident Evil universe and somehow involved ninjas. The game would have been structured much like the original Resident Evil, but would have taken place inside of a ninja house rather than a mansion. Yoshiki Okamoto revealed the details about this game in an interview with the Japanese magazine Dengeki Nintendo. The ninja house was to contain a series of booby traps as environmental hazards, and battles were to be fought using a katana and shuriken. Other concepts included hidden doors, falling ceilings, scrolls and ninja magic, and many other ninja techniques. Many of the ideas conceived in the planning stages of Sengoku Biohazard, though, did eventually make their way into Onimusha. Multiple references to the British rock band Queen and their album Made in Heaven can be found scattered within several different Resident Evil games. Chris Redfield's unlockable costume in the first game features a design with the text Made in Heaven written on the back. This design again appears as a default costume for his sister Claire Redfield in Resident Evil 2. Additionally, the original Made in Heaven jacket can be seen hanging above Chris's office at the police station in Resident Evil 2 and 3. In Code Veronica, the back of Claire's jacket reads, "Let Me Live," the title of the third track on the Made in Heaven album. And finally, Billy Cohen from Resident Evil 0 has a tattoo on his arm that reads Mother Love, the name of the fourth track from Made in Heaven. Several Resident Evil games have hidden references to previous games in the series. In Resident Evil Uprising for mobile phones, a sticky note can be found in the police department describing a recipe for a Gill sandwich. This is a reference to Resident Evil 1, where Gill is almost crushed, but is saved by Barry Burton. Barry then says,
"You were almost a Gill sandwich."
This event was referenced again in Capcom's Dead Rising, in which a restaurant called Gill's Sandwiches can be found in the mall. One of the series' most unusual Easter eggs, though, can be found in Wesker's office. If the player searches Wesker's desk 50 times, an item can be found called Film D, which when developed in the dark room will show a picture of Rebecca Chambers in athletic clothing holding a basketball.
Did you know? The TurboGrafx 16 port of Splatterhouse had a parental advisory on the box stating the horrifying theme of this game may be inappropriate for young children and cowards. But the back of the box said the game was for ages 10 and up, implying that it was suitable for children. This wasn't the first time a game received a content warning, but it was one of the first for violence instead of sex. The Splatterhouse series made waves with its graphic violence and naturally has a long, interesting history with video game ratings systems. Splatterhouse 2 was released in 1992 before Sega of America started voluntarily rating their games. However, the North American version did feature a warning on the cover that read, "This game contains scenes depicting graphic violence which may not be suitable for younger players." It was the first North American game to have such a warning on the front as opposed to the back, like 1990's Technocop and Stormlord.
16 years later, when it was released on the North American Wii Virtual Console, Splatterhouse 2 would retroactively receive a mature rating, making it the only game with an M rating on Virtual Console. Its third entry, Splatterhouse 3, which released after Sega started its voluntary rating system, was rated MA13, which wasn't even Sega's highest maturity rating at the time. Yet, it still featured the same warning that it wasn't for kids. Games like Mortal Kombat 2 and Lethal Enforcers got the higher MA17 rating, but without any extra warning. An ad for Splatterhouse 3 joked that it was the type of game rating systems were invented for, which was enough to get it featured in the Violence in Video Games Senate hearings in December 1993.
It includes deadly new weapons, 6 levels of monster bashing mayhem, and killer special moves.
It's kind of incredible that this is the only mention Splatterhouse got in the hearing, considering it's a series that lets the player cut demon fetuses with a chainsaw. While the Splatterhouse series is of course violent, it's important to note that players never kill any people or humans in the series, at least none that aren't already possessed by otherworldly evil.
There are 5 games in the Splatterhouse series, including Splatterhouses 1 through 3, the 2010 reboot, and Splatterhouse Wanpaku Graffiti, a chibi spin-off for the Famicom. Wanpaku, which literally means naughty or mischievous in Japanese, includes spoofs of American horror culture and some choice English dialogue like, "Be garbage of cesspool, ha 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 ha." Though it remains the only major entry to never see release in the West, it must have impressed Namco as the game's developer, now Production Co., was given the keys to the series 3 years later for Splatterhouses 2 and 3. Splatterhouse has seen its fair share of voluntary censorship. The arcade version of the original Splatterhouse features a fight in a church and other religious imagery that was taken out of the TurboGrafx 16 port. The port also features less blood and gore, but that's more likely due to the graphical limitations of the console, as these changes are also present in the Japanese PC Engine version. Other differences include a reduced frame count for enemy animations, missing or compressed sound effects, and other minor gameplay differences. For example, the TurboGrafx Rick has a bigger hitbox, can hit enemies further back, and is rewarded 2 hearts after completing a level instead of the arcade's single heart. The game was also ported to the little-known Japanese system, the FM Towns Marty, which is a near-arcade perfect port. It was also given a Tighe Electronic handheld port and an iOS port, which featured an exclusive endless mode called Splatter Rush.
Though the Terror Mask is supposed to be a Mayan relic, it bears a striking resemblance to Jason Voorhees' mask in the Friday the 13th horror series. The TurboGrafx 16 port colored the mask red to help fend off copyright claims, but Namco wised up and made the mask more skull-like as the series progressed. And this isn't the only horror movie connection Splatterhouse has. The series has several intentional references to a handful of horror movies. Just to name a few, Laughing Deer Heads in Wanpaku Graffiti and Vomiting Deer Heads in Splatterhouse 2 reference Evil Dead 2. 2. Wanpaku Graffiti's first boss is a girl whose head spins around, referencing The Exorcist. The series' main antagonist, Dr. West, is named after Herbert West, a character in Stuart Gordon's Reanimator. And in the 2010 reboot, a burnt corpse wearing a glove is seen along with a red and green sweater next to a boiler, referencing Freddy Krueger from A Nightmare on Elm Street.
In 2008, Bandai Namco announced they were bringing back Splatterhouse with Rise of Kasai developers Bottle Rocket Entertainment. It was a full series reboot with 3D action gameplay in the style of God of War and Devil May Cry. It would even feature Jim Cummings as the voice of the Terror Mask and also have numerous references to the previous games, like a boss fight with Biggie Man, the dual chainsaw-armed maniac. However, Bandai Namco fired the team in 2009 and finished the game themselves. A few Bottle Rocket developers joined Bandai Namco to help finish the project, and Bottle Rocket closed its doors in September 2009. When the Splatterhouse reboot finally dropped in November 2010 for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, it was met with a lukewarm reception, but has since gained a cult following. As a bonus, the reboot featured the original 3 games, including the fully uncensored version of the arcade original. This is the first time the game was given a wide release in America, but it wouldn't be the last, as it was also featured in the recent Namco Museum for Switch, which was only rated teen. In 2013, Caitlin Oliver became the first woman to set a world record high score for a classic arcade game in nearly 30 years, and her game of choice was Splatterhouse. The previous record was set by Doris Self for Qbert in 1984. Though numbers are vague, Splatterhouse arcade machines were not common in the US during its heyday, probably because of its graphic violence. The international version is pretty rare. The Japanese version is reportedly more common.
While there were decades between the third game and the 2010 remake, Splatterhouse cameos made their way into Bandai Namco games throughout the years, like in Point Blank 3, Tekken Dark Resurrection, and Tales of Eternia. Some cutscenes from We Love Katamari feature a remake of the Splatterhouse 1 ending theme, which itself is a video game rendition of the song Sento nel Core by Italian Baroque composer Alessandro Scarletti. Katsuro Tajima, who did the original music for Splatterhouse 1, was also a composer on We Love Katamari. Bandai Namco released this version on the official soundtrack for the PSP's Me and My Katamari, which is called Katamari Original Soundtrack Damacy, or Complete Sounds of Katamari, depending on the retailer or the translator. Katsuro Tajima is credited as the composer of this track on that CD. And that's not the only connection between the two series. Now Production Co. also developed 2007's Beautiful Katamari for the Xbox 360. Actually, Now Production Co. went on to become one of Japan's biggest contract developers and has been involved in many franchises with companies like Nintendo, Sega, Konami, Capcom, and Sony, the most prominent of these being Sonic, Adventure Island, Katamari Damacy, and of course, Splatterhouse.
Did you know? Speedrunning's earliest beginnings can be traced back to Activision's 1980 Atari 2600 game, Dragster. Not only was Dragster one of the first commercial video games based entirely on beating a timer, but the game's instruction manual also challenged players to achieve a time of under 6 seconds. Anyone who sent Activision a picture of their sub-6-second time would join the company's world-class Dragster Club, making it the first video game included in a speedrunning contest as well. The concept of speedrunning would resurface for the 1990 Nintendo World Championships. According to the competition's rules, players had 6 minutes and 21 seconds to achieve the highest score possible across Super Mario Bros., Rad Racer, and Tetris. There were also score multipliers. For example, collecting 50 coins in Super Mario Bros. Gave a ×1 score multiplier. Completing the course in Rad Racer granted a ×10 multiplier, and getting a high score in Tetris gave a ×25 multiplier. Eric OmniGamer Koziel, author of Speedrun Science, commented on the event's impact. Koziel wrote, "Doing even reasonably well in Tetris would dwarf your combined score from the other two games. The strategy became to complete Super Mario Bros. And Rad Racer as quickly as possible. The final time limit also spurred competitors to play for speed in Tetris. The Nintendo World Championships had unintentionally included all the makings of a modern speedrun, learning the fundamentals behind your targeted games and mechanics, exploring strategies for optimizing the time taken, coming up with a best route, and then finally performing that route. However, speedrunning wouldn't truly take off until the release of Doom. Doom's contribution to the speedrunning scene came from it featuring savable gameplay demos. In short, a demo is a timed recording of every single input, all saved in order to a file. The demo file can then be reloaded into the game where it's played back, effectively producing a perfect recording. Demo files were commonly used in arcade games to record gameplay footage for attract modes, but Doom became one of the first games where players could make, share, and play back these demos. This was groundbreaking, as video capture and encoding tech was virtually non-existent at the time for hobbyists. The demo files' small size also made them easy to share online, which was essential due to the limited internet speeds of the time. The team behind Doom decided to include demos late in development, largely for kicks, and had no idea what impact it'd leave on the gaming community. Doom designer and coder John Romero recalled, "We thought that demos would be shared for skillful play, and we thought it'd be for showing really cool death matches, but we didn't think about it for speedrunning in particular, because speedrunning was not a thing we hooked into the game as a special way of playing it. Speedrunning was just a concept, and it wasn't a big thing back then either. It's something that some people did, but it was very rare." Following Doom's release, a few online communities formed around sharing demos. Many demos were shared for bragging rights, which led to the creation of challenge runs. Some were straightforward, such as beating any level with 100% kills, whereas others were more obtuse, like the Tyson challenge. This challenge requires players to get 100% kills using only fists, chainsaw, the pistol, or the berserk power-up. When simply achieving these challenges was no longer impressive, players began to compete on who could complete them fastest. Romero stated, "Speed demonstrates your skill at the game. So you got 100 kills? And how fast? You didn't shoot anything with the pistol, but how fast did you get it done?" So speed was always the highest ranked thing without the score being any part of it. This is because it spoke to your knowledge of the game and how good you were. Anybody could achieve things slowly, but that's not competitive. One of the most important websites born during this time was Compete-N, which had an online leaderboard for all the Doom challenges players devised. Furthermore, each challenge was categorized and graded on speed, and runs could be easily submitted, verified, and watched by gamers from around the world. These features led Compete-N to become the first major organized speedrunning community in history. Doom's speedrunning scene continued to grow from there, but the next step in the sport came from another id Software game in 1996, Quake. Much like Doom, Quake allowed players to save and share demo files, and, once again, online communities formed around sharing these demos. Among these websites was Nightmare Speed Demos, which hosted speedruns exclusively in the game's Nightmare difficulty setting. However, the website's creator, a speedrunner known as Nolan Radix Flug, and various members of his community found bigger aspirations. At the time, most demos only recorded speedruns of single levels, but Radix and 3 other speedrunners banded together to create a single demo file speedrunning the entirety of Quake. This was done by stitching together the demo files of the best individual runs for every level in the game to create a complete Quake speedrun known as Quake Done Quick. Radix said, "There was a team of 4 of us that did the first Quake Done Quick movie in early 1997. As a team, we came up with all kinds of tricks that I don't think an individual would have. Then we did Quake Done Quicker a few months later, and then Quake Done Quick with a Vengeance came a few years after that. Eventually, the Nightmare Speed Demos, Quake Done Quick, and other Quake speedrunning communities banded together under a new website dubbed Speed Demos Archive in 1998. The website continued to serve as the major Quake speedrunning hub in the following years, but Speed Demos Archive eventually spread its wings with the help of Retro Studios' Metroid Prime in 2002. Radix was a huge Super Metroid fan who sent his best completion times to Nintendo Power in his youth, and was enamored by the Metroid Prime community on GameFAQs. The board found several tricks and sequence breaks to play the game faster. This, along with the Metroid 2K2 community, pushed Radix to complete a Metroid Prime speedrun. Radix said, "So I decided, gosh, I have this device I can use to capture video. I'm going to record myself playing Metroid Prime and see how fast I can do it. After about 3 months, I had completed my speedrun, and my time was 1 hour and 37 minutes. So I thought, well, now I have to publish this. But YouTube didn't exist. I did have this site called Speed Demos Archive, and that's nice and generic. It doesn't say anything about Quake in there, so I thought, I'll just post it there." Not only was his Metroid Prime speedrun 30 minutes faster than the prior best run, but it was also publicly available via direct feed video on a website with enough bandwidth to easily host it for all to enjoy. Although Radix originally just decided to host the run on his website out of convenience, the decision paved the way for a new age of speedrunning. Following the run's immense popularity, Speed Demos Archive began to accept runs from games besides Quake. While other speedrunning communities had their own websites, typically focusing on a single game or series, Speed Demos Archive became the major hub of the speedrunning scene for both PC and console games alike. The next chapter in the speedrunning scene came from Japan. after a gamer under the name Morimoto published a time attack video of Super Mario Bros. 3 online that took the internet by storm in 2003. The impressive speedrun used perfect jumps and glitches without a single mistake, beating the entire game in 11 minutes and 3 seconds flat. However, Morimoto later updated the description of the video stating the run had been achieved using speed hacks to slow the game down, and that they used countless emulator save states to achieve the result. This would be known today as a tool-assisted speedrun, or TAS. According to speedrunner PJ DeCaesar, the reveal proved to be polarizing, stating, "Morimoto's run was world-shaking when it came out. It was like, what, you can beat this game in 11 minutes? That's crazy. I just thought it was the coolest thing and I was interested in watching more videos like it." Then the classic misconception of TASes came out. Boo, he didn't play the game, he just stitched together a video frame by frame. In all actuality, Morimoto's run was far from the first TAS ever created. A website simply named Tool Assisted Speedruns, collecting such runs from games like Doom and others, existed 4 years earlier in 1999. However, the popularity of Morimoto's runs spread awareness of the speedrunning scene and opened up a new world of possibilities to speedrunners of the day. As emulators continued to grow, improve, and become more accessible into the mid-2000s, so did the TAS scene. Advancements like frame counters, frame advancing, memory viewers, lag counters, input editing, and more gave rise to better and better TASes as the year went on. Although the TAS and speedrunning scenes got off to a rocky start at first, relations warmed over time. TAS video co-owner Adelicat wrote, "Morimoto's TAS was often misunderstood to be a real speedrun. I think this led to speedrunners' initial impression of TASes as deceptive and cheating. I think better understanding has made that friction largely go away. TASes often serve as research and the proof of concept movies that speedrunners can take, adapt, and practice. In the early days, speedrunning wasn't very collaborative. These days, everyone is sharing ideas with everyone else. It truly is a communal effort. Everyone wants to see the best possible real-time and TAS movies and do what they can to contribute. Meanwhile, the decision to open Speedrun Demos archive to any game quickly caused issues. Radix, who ran the site by himself at the time, was unable to confirm whether or not speedruns for games he wasn't familiar with were legitimate or used some kind of cheat. This initially forced Radix to only accept runs for games he personally knew, such as Quake, Doom, Half-Life, Super Metroid, Super Mario Bros., and The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Regardless, even with this limited list, Radix struggled to keep up with the onslaught of speedruns that were constantly sent his way. Thus, the verification process was born, allowing others in the community familiar with the game to confirm if the run was legit or not. During this time, rules were established for what was and wasn't allowed in runs, and how runs were ranked on the archive. Some significant decisions included determining speedrunning categories for each game, only accepting direct game capture, thereby denying runs that used a camera pointed at the TV screen, and timing runs from the instant a player gained control of their character until they've lost it at the end of the game. These rules have continued to evolve over the years alongside advances in technology and the speedrunning scene overall. Although improvements in emulation, internet speeds, and video capture technology helped speedrunning become more accessible to more people, the impact these advancements had on the popularity of speedrunning paled in comparison to the dawn of live streaming. As live streaming took off in the late 2000s and into the 2010s, speedrunning rapidly transformed from a solitary hobby where runners spent weeks alone perfecting runs to a spectator sport. Eric Koziel wrote, "Chat services accompanying most broadcasts enable direct interaction between runners and viewers, with questions and comments breaking up the sometimes tedious task of grinding away at a run. Speedruns themselves were still largely personal projects, but the act of finishing them was made that much more pleasant by sharing it with others. On the flip side, this loosened Speed Demos archives' dominance in the speedrunning scene over the years. Runners who didn't like the website's rules or couldn't stand waiting for their run to be approved found instant gratification by streaming records online. In fact, as many runners developed fan bases to support them during record attempts, streaming rapidly became closely tied to the act of speedrunning itself. According to Koziel, anyone who ran games was almost expected to stream as well. But Speed Demos Archive wasn't done turning the speedrunning community on its head quite yet, as the website, or rather its community, led the charge into the next evolution of the scene: marathons. The Speed Demos Archive community weren't the first to come up with the idea. That honor goes to a group of speedrunners under the name the Speed Gamers, who were inspired by Desert Bus for Hope, an event by comedy troupe Loading Ready Run, where members live-streamed a marathon of the mini-game Desert Bus for charity. In March 2008, the Speed Gamers blasted through every single mainline Zelda game within 3 days live, to raise money for St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital in the first speedrun marathon ever. The Speed Gamers followed this up with 7 more live marathons over the next 2 years. Although, while each event proved to be successful, they failed to break into the mainstream. Nevertheless, the idea inspired the Speed Demos Archives' community, including site administrator Mike Uyama. Uyama recalled, "In summer of 2009, people on the forums saw the Speed Gamers as marathons, and the community went, 'We should do these marathons ourselves.' When I stepped in, I said, 'Whoa, this is a good idea, but we need to give it some focus.' From here, Uyama decided the event should take place at the already established gaming convention MagFest, and that the games should focus on 8-bit and 16-bit games. This led to the name Classic Games Done Quick. Unfortunately, despite the group's best efforts, last-minute internet issues with the MagFest's hotel ultimately forced Uyama to cancel his convention plans and stream the event out of his mother's basement. Regardless, Classic Games Done Quick managed to raise $10,531 for charity over January 1st to the 3rd of 2010. Next, in 2011, the group returned under the new name Awesome Games Done Quick, allowing modern games into the marathon. The event was also extended to 5 days. This time around, the team managed to raise $52,519, nearly 5 times as much as the year prior. After this success, they were hooked. Uyama stated, "Right after the event, there was this realization that, hey, this was really fun. It had a real magic that speedrunning didn't have before. Let's do it again." I've made a lot of mistakes from each marathon, because there's always a growth and learning process. But I've also had a lot of success and grown the community a lot, because each marathon gets bigger and bigger. The organization reached a turning point at the Awesome Games Done Quick 2014, marking the first time charity donations broke into 7 figures, with a total of $1,031,665, as well as the first time spectating attendees outnumbered speedrunners. Today, Games Done Quick attracts thousands of attendees, hundreds of thousands of live viewers online, and millions of dollars every year. The numbers have continued to grow annually, with 50,000 donors banding together, giving $3,039,596 at Summer Games Done Quick 2019. Speedrunning's evolution hasn't ended with marathons either. The streaming age has helped many new and unique forms of speedrunning flourish, such as speedrun races. At its core, speedrun racing pits 2 or more speedrunners against one another to see who can beat a game the fastest in a single sitting. This brings a whole new dynamic to speedrunning, as restarting a run brings a heavy price, making certain tricks and glitches incredibly risky. While the speedrun racing scene is still somewhat new, a number of variations have already emerged. There are multi-game speedruns, where speedrunners race through a number of games in succession to see who can beat them all the fastest. There's also blind speedrun racing, where runners don't know, and often haven't even played, the games they race on. As well as randomized runs, where runners go through a classic game that's been modded, typically randomly switching out the locations of power-ups. Speedrunning has come a long way from its humble origins, and its future looks bright. Koziel concluded, "I don't ever see speedrunning dying off. The activity will continue to grow and change, but the competitive drive at its core is part of human nature. So long as humans are driven by a need to develop and improve skills, there will always be room to add a timer on top to measure just how well it can be done."